Morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. As you can see, I'm not Rabbi Manning. My name is Joel Kenigsberg. For those who don't know me, I'm the rabbi here in Bet Knesset Nasi. For those who do know me, I'm still the rabbi in Bet Knesset Nasi. And very, very happy to be here with you this morning. I'll be here this morning and next week as well, giving the shir while Rabbi Manning is away. And I thought we would I would stick to the topic of contemporary halachic issues. I know he hasn't really been talking about that. He's been talking about something else. But I wanted to talk about contemporary halachic issues, contemporary halachic dilemmas. Maybe just by way of introduction, I'll say the following. You know, we live in an age where technology is advancing at such a pace. You know, it's very, very difficult to keep up. What once upon a time took years now takes months, weeks, maybe days, maybe even hours. And almost every day there are new things coming up, there are new issues being raised, there are new technologies that have been developed. So and the halachic system has to keep up. Not only keep up, but try and lead the way as well. So just, by way of example, some of the questions that have come up and some of the things which, I think in the last few weeks even, questions which our ancestors could not even fathom, could not even imagine. So for example, there was a case in the news this past couple of weeks, we spoke about it, those who were here in Shul, during the week between Mincha and Mariv, just mentioned. There was a case where one of the hospitals in Israel, where there was IVF, assisted reproductive technology, was done, and a baby was born. And just before the baby was born, the hospital realized, I'm not sure how they realized it, why they only realized, 30 weeks into the pregnancy, but the wrong embryo had been implanted into the mother. In other words, it was the genetic material of a different mother, and now this set of parents had the baby. And there's a question here. Question, halachically, who is actually considered the mother of this child? There's a question, now that this is the case and this is what's happened, who should have custody of the child? Who should raise the child? The case is currently in court, but there's a halachic dilemma as well. So it's a fascinating and tragic case that is happening. That's one example. Again, I won't go into it now. We can maybe discuss it another time if people are interested. Another example, another case, contemporary halachic issue that comes up. Anybody who's heard me speak before has probably heard me talk about this topic. But this question of lab-grown meat, cultured meat, whatever you want to call it, where you take stem cells from a cow and it's grown in a lab, and you have meat at the end of the day. Is it kosher? Is it meaty? Is it parav? What is it? How do we look at it? Again, things which, never mind thousands of years ago, decades ago, people couldn't have thought of, couldn't have comprehended. There are all sorts of questions that come up regarding space in halakha. Is a Jewish astronaut allowed to go into space? And there have been cases, and the shilas have been asked. When would you keep Shabbat in space, for example? That's quite a tricky one. So all sorts of halachic dilemmas, and these things come up all the time. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is a unique category of halachic dilemmas which comes up in the state of Israel. The fact that we have a state, the fact that we've been here for the last 80-odd years, and we have our own government, maybe, and we have our own army, and we have all sorts of things. This raises many, many questions, many halachic issues. And before we get into any of the specifics or any of the particular questions, the question is raised is the halakha able to deal with the scenario? Does halakha have what to say about it? I know what I think, and hopefully by the end of the show I'll convince you. But let me start off with a couple of scenarios. Let me read to you a couple of scenarios and see what we say, what we think about them. These may be real or imaginary. We'll see later on. The first scenario takes place. This is on Yud Gimel Elohav Tafshin Chet. So this is in 1948. This is, the case is Erev Shabbat. A few hours before Shabbat comes in Jerusalem, Count Bernadotte, the UN representative, is murdered. That night, the government, the army, the police, there is an ongoing diplomatic activity trying to deal with the UN, which back then was not as hostile to us as it is today. All the officials, all the employees of Mishrad HaChutz, of the Foreign Department, of the police, of the security services, everybody is called in that night. This is emergency work. This has to be done. And the Pkidim HaDatiyim, the observant members of the diplomatic corps, they're at home celebrating Shabbat. That is case number one. Case number two, also in Yud Gimel Elo Tafshin Ayin Bet, about 70 years later. The case is as follows. It's Erev Shabbat. Major Aleph, we don't know his name, but he's a Shomer Mitzvot. He's an observant Jew. He's the head of a certain department in the IDF spokesman's unit. A short while before Shabbat, he receives a message from his officers that on one of the major television channels, there is about to be published, again, this is a few moments before Shabbat comes in, about to be published an article, a katava, right, about the activity of the army, and it is not a complimentary article, shall we say. So Aleph has to decide immediately, how does he respond? Does he go out and give a media interview? Does he? What actions need to be taken? Many of the actions that he could take involve Chilul Shabbat, involve desecrating Shabbat on a Doraita level. Is he allowed to do that? Now, this was a real case. So Aleph said he remembers that he recently read a wonderful article written in Tchumen about exactly this topic called Pikuach Nefesh Hilchati, and the conclusion of the article was if there is no immediate and direct danger to life, then he can't do anything. So he doesn't respond, there's no response, and the name of the IDF and the name of Israel is, over the whole weekend, is all over the news. Okay, these are just some of the questions, but these are just some examples. For 2,000 years, nobody could fathom, nobody could imagine that there could be such questions, and there are many, many, many more. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but this is what was called Hilchot Mashiach. For 2,000 years, these were the halachot of Mashiach. These were things we could not imagine. But nowadays, there are many, many, and this is just to whet your appetite, these questions that come up. We live in unique times, we live in extraordinary times, and there are extraordinary challenges and extraordinary opportunities that come with that through halakha. Again, I want to stress, this shir is not dealing specifically, although the examples we gave were related to war. This is not just related to the war, to this war, any other war that we fought. This is a much broad, many issues will come up by the nature of it through the war. But this is a much, much broader issue and much more and much greater challenge. At this point, we'll hand out the handout. There's just one page, it's double-sided, so take one and pass on. Okay, so while people are getting the handout, I'll start reading the first source. And I like quoting this because this comes from the Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer was one of the most important poskim of this generation. He was the Rav he was the posek of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. I hope that there are enough sheets. If there are not enough, people may have to just share. Okay, and the Tzitz Eliezer actually wrote, again, he was, if we were to classify him, ask, in which camp he belongs, in more what you'd probably call Haredi. But nonetheless, he wrote about 20 volumes, more than 20 volumes of shut, of responsa on every possible conceivable contemporary issue. And he wrote a whole section called Hilchot Medina, dealing with the unique questions that arise in our generation, the unique questions that arise as part of running a state. He also has a separate volume called Shvitat Hayam, which is 3 volumes dealing with how to run a navy on Shabbat. So he writes this in his introduction to Hilchot Medina. This is really just to frame the discussion before we get into the really controversial bit. He says, "B'shuv Hashem et shevitenu kafikim b'negev v'zakoto otanu b'linat hakoteh achlei zira b'dima." Okay, there are a couple of extra sheets here if anybody needs. So he says, "B'tchalta tegula," we're at the beginning of redemption. "B'tkumat medinatenu al chelek me'admat kodshenu," we have the revival of our state on part of our land. "Im memshal atzmi mishalanu," we have our own government. "Asher lemalei haplaot gam bogim yitzbiu aleinu v'yomu higdil Hashem lasot imele." Right, quoting the words we say from Shir Malot, he says, "This is so miraculous." He's writing shortly after the creation of the state. He says, even amongst the world, they will point us and say how wondrous this is. Nowadays, they say other things, but never mind. "Niftach lefanenu ofkei halacha chadashim v'omadnu lifnei tafkidim gdolim." We have new horizons of halacha which have been created. We have a new mission to fulfill. "Chovateinu la'orot nativ v'derech lomar shava l'tchiyah." We have to, when he says we, our obligation is relating to the Poskei Halacha. He says we have to show a path for the nation that is returning to life. "Liflosh al chukei Torah mishpatea," to incorporate the laws of the Torah and statutes, "B'Torah shebichtav v'sheba'al peh nimtza kol hachukim v'mishpatim hashayachim lamdina v'alichotea." Again, we'll see a little bit later, the implicit question that he's answering and who he's really arguing against here. But he says you should know that within the Torah shebichtav and within the Torah sheba'al peh, we have all the answers. We have all the principles. It's there. The Torah is eternal. It contains the answers for the situation. והפתרונים לכל הדברים, שבין אדם לאדם, בין אדם למדינה, לכל התקופות והדורות. For every generation, for every period, etc. So, why am I giving such a long introduction? And why does the Tzitzi Eliezer feel the need to stress these words? So maybe let me read you another scenario. This does not appear in your handout, but just to understand where the opposition to this comes from. We understand the opposition, we understand quite what the debate is and why it is so vociferous. So this was from an article that was published in a certain newspaper, which I'll remain nameless. It was a number of years ago when one of the officials in one of the assistant advisors for the Prime Minister, a very high up position in the Prime Minister's office, was a Yehudi Shomer Torah Mitzvot, was an observant Jew with the kippah. And this author, this columnist for the newspaper, noticed that many of the Prime Minister's inner circle are actually observant Jews. So he writes the following, and he writes quite disparagingly about what a terrible situation this is. He says, האם יעלה על הדעת, כפי שנהוג לומר, שבמדינת ישראל, במזרח התיכון... Sorry? Yeah, this is not on your handout. This is Torah sheba'al peh. שבמדינת ישראל, במזרח התיכון שאין בו רגע. He says, is it possible, is it conceivable, that in the Middle East, which is a very exciting place, if you haven't noticed, right? There's not a moment, you miss a beat, you've missed everything. So in that situation, ראש הממשלה יהיה מנוע משיחה עם יועצו המדיני. He says the Prime Minister is not going to be able to talk to his closest diplomatic advisor, עם ראש הסגל שלו, with his chief of staff, ועם יועצו לביטחון לאומי, or with his advisor for national security, החל מכניסת שבת ועד צאתה, from the beginning of Shabbat until the end of Shabbat. Okay, already you can hear that the person who's writing this article is sorely lacking in most basic knowledge of Jewish law, because we know pikuach nefesh tochei Shabbat. But anyway, so this is what he thinks. He thinks, okay, they're going to be shomer Shabbat, so they have to turn the phone off from the beginning of Shabbat to the end of Shabbat, as we do. Obviously, if you sit in the Prime Minister's office, it's a little bit different. But this is the picture that he paints. He says, מה קורה למשל כשמצרים מתחלף שלטון בוויקנד? He says, what happens in Egypt, you can fill in you can change the names. Nothing ever changes here. It's just, change the names, change the countries, but it's all the same story. But, there's an overthrow of the government over Shabbat. And then they won't know about it. האם ראש הממשלה מחכה להופעת הכוכבים הראשונים בשמי השבת לפני שהוא פותח בסבב התייעצויות? He paints this picture. You imagine the Prime Minister looking outside, counting the stars before he can begin his meetings. Obviously, that's not the way it goes. Before he starts calling his advisors, etc., he says, is it logical that שראש הממשלה מעדכן מדי מוצאי שבת את יועציו המדיניים על האירועים שהתרחשו בזירה הבינלאומית? He says, what's going to happen? Every Motzei Shabbat, they're going to start off the cabinet meeting or whatever. Prime Minister's going to say, okay, summary of the weekend's news. This is what happened, guys. Now what should we do? That is the approach that comes along, as I say. This approach is born out of ignorance. But where does it come from? It comes from a place of understanding that for 2,000 years, we looked at Torah, we looked at Halacha, we saw it on an individual level, and we'll see some of the cases that Halacha does bring. And it's not, one would think, okay, everything carries on the same way that it always did. The Halacha, the way that it's being practiced, the way that it's being expressed, is not compatible with the functioning of a new modern state. Shabbat is really the case in point where this conflict brings to bear. So it's not, as nonsensical as this piece which I just read to you is, it's not completely without basis or for somebody who's not immersed in the literature. And let's look at two examples that we had throughout the generations, which we see two cases which the Halacha always relate to, the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim related to it on an individual level. And if we were to keep observing on an individual level in a modern state, it just wouldn't work, right? And something would have to change. So the first example I want to give comes from the world of refuah, from the world of medicine. And there's a lot that's spoken about doctors on Shabbat, about hospitals on Shabbat. So let's put aside pikuach nefesh for the moment, because we know pikuach nefesh, something which is immediately life-threatening or life-saving, that you can break Shabbat, that you can do whatever needs to be done, with the exception of 3 mitzvot, which are yareg bar yavu. But just ordinarily, there are many things in routine work of a doctor. We have any doctors in the audience today? Normally there's quite a few. So you'll know, and if you've been a doctor and if you've been a patient as well, you'll know that there are many things which a doctor does, many things, routine operations which take place in a hospital, which are not directly connected to pikuach nefesh. Not that act in and of itself is not directly involved in the process of saving a life. So, for example, the question is asked, if somebody is a doctor, and this question was asked long before we had a state, right? Somebody's a doctor, can they, and they have their shift, which falls out on Shabbat, and they're going to be required to do all sorts of things which are not, which the Halacha does not permit them to do on Shabbat. What should they do? So have a look at source number 2. This is Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg, who was a scholar in residence here about a year ago in our shul. He lives not too far from here in Tel Bia, and he is the world expert, the world authority on Jewish medical ethics, and he writes the following in his Sefer 7-volume book called Refuah Halacha. So here he's addressing the case of TORAH konanut rofeh b'Shabbat, a doctor who is on duty on Shabbat. So he says, Rofeh aved bebet cholim, v'tzarech la'asot TORAH b'Shabbat. A doctor who works in a hospital and his shift falls out on Shabbat, adif she'achlif et toraniyot ha'Shabbat shelo rofeh goy. He says, if there is another, again, I'm not going to get into all the technicalities. We could give an entire share, an entire series of shiurim just on that sentence. But he says that the question is asked, there is a Jewish doctor and a non-Jewish doctor. Could he swap his shift so he won't run into all these problems about Shmirat Shabbat? He says it's preferable. Now already, that is an answer that was fitting for the Galut. That was an answer that maybe it's fitting for the state of Israel as well. I'm not sure yet. But when we see things like this, and we see Halacha speaks in this language, this kind of language for 2,000 years, it's an individual problem. What do you, as the individual doctor, how do you keep Shabbat? Okay, somebody else will do it, right? Somebody else's problem. We can, if you can switch the shift, he goes on, he discusses. If you can't switch the shift, how do you do it? How do you manage it, etc. But number one, he says switch the shift with somebody non-Jewish. A fascinating question that comes up, I'll just mention, is if he can switch the shift with another Jew who is not Shomer Shabbat. Are you allowed to do that? Is it preferable not to do that? That's a fascinating discussion, again, for another time. But the point is, we see psikot like this. And then people like our friend who wrote his article in the newspaper say, okay, well, now we have a state, and now we have a country. What you're telling me is that you can't have observant doctors on Shabbat. In other words, what you're telling me is that a Jewish state that wants to run according to halacha has to close the hospitals on Shabbat. That doesn't make sense. In other words, the halacha doesn't have an answer of how to run a state on Shabbat. That's what we see from here. Now, the point is that for 2,000 years, we didn't have a state, so we didn't have to answer. That wasn't the question that we were being asked. That's not what the halacha was trying to address. We're now trying to address something new. So the question is, do we need to create a new framework? Or do we need to have a paradigm shift of the old framework and start to view it a little bit differently? Okay, so that's example number one. Just, the Minchat Yitzchak, source number 3, Ravais, from the Edah Haredit. So he says, for example, I won't get into the whole thing, it's a long discussion, but basically, the question that he's asked here is a certain individual who was, I'm not sure exactly what the case was, but this person was in some sort of a hospital, rehabilitatory facility for a long time. He's not able to leave. Eventually, they come to an agreement that he can stay, because they wanted to kick him out. They came to an agreement that he can stay, but he has to work there. And the job that they've offered him is to be the Röntgen technician, doing all sorts of things with the x-rays and turning on the buttons. Right? He has a long discussion, halacha, and essentially what comes out of it is that part of the job entails things which are not on Shabbat, which are not directly pikuach nefesh, and therefore, Rabbi says the last line, he says, he says, don't get involved in this profession. Don't do it. You're going to be in a position, this job is going to make you do things which are mechalel Shabbat. Again, he's not saying that a country can run without these kind of people. You need it, but it's not our problem. For 2,000 years, it wasn't our problem. And that's why, based on that, so if we just extrapolate that further, we say, okay, if you're a doctor, you're in the Prime Minister's office, whatever it is, you're not going to be able to do anything. The whole country has to stop. It doesn't make sense. That's one example. We'll give another example. I don't think I brought this on the handout, but there's the question of, we discussed this on Shavuot, for those who are members of the shul, but we discussed the question of milking cows on Shabbat. It's interesting, somebody spoke to me the week of Shavuot, said, what shir did you give on Tikkun Leil? I said, we spoke about milking cows on Shavuot. And they said, well, I'm sure that's very relevant for all of your kahila. So I don't think any of you are going to be anytime soon called up for the question of whether you need to milk a cow on Shabbat. But through that we learn a principle. Through that we learn a dynamic, a way of, even a philosophical underpinning of how the halachic system works. And that's why I think it's very important to discuss. I use that example because this is maybe one of the most well-developed examples when the Chalutzim started to come back and the Moshavim and the Kibbutzim started to be built up in Eretz Israel. So one of the earliest questions, and therefore it's one of the most hotly debated, and it's one of the most, we have a lot of halachic literature on this, of the question of what do you do with the Jewish moshavim and milking cows on Shabbat. Many of you were in the shirs. I'm not going to repeat everything. But essentially, again, it was a different question in the Galut, and it's a different question in Eretz Yisrael. Throughout the Galut, the answer always was, a Jew has a cow, or one cow or two cows, whatever it is. So for the day of Shabbat, you get a non-Jew to milk your cow, or you throw away the milk, and that's it. Again, we're looking for a particular solution to a particular problem for an individual. When it becomes a question on a national level, is it feasible? Can we say, for all the moshavim that want to keep Shabbat, employ non-Jews to milk the cows, or throw away all the milk? Right? Again, it doesn't seem feasible anymore. And therefore, you have these voices that come along and say, well, the halacha cannot deal with the situation. And again, what I'm trying to show is that the reason why the halacha could not deal with the situation is because that wasn't the situation. That's not what the halacha was asked. But if the halacha is now being asked and genuinely, authentically being asked, how do we deal with this? So we have a way to deal with this. So all of this leads us to a fascinating booklet, which was published in the early years of the state. Okay, here, this is just the front page for you to get a sense. It's called Kontras HaVikuach, which means the argument. Right, so it's, we're in Israel after all, and that's what we do. We argue. So who was arguing, and who was and why were they arguing? So all of that introduction was to show where this argument is coming from. In 1951, so we're 3 years after the establishment of the state, there's a professor who I'm sure you've all heard of by the name of Yeshayahu Leibovich. And Leibovich is the one who says, and he's very, very forceful, and as you know, he was very, very strong in his opinions. He didn't mince words, and he didn't hold anything back, and he was a little bit controversial, to put it mildly. And he says this is essentially, his thesis is that the corpus of halacha as we know it cannot deal with a modern state. And the most acute problem of this is Shabbat. He says that the halacha cannot deal with a modern state, with the running of a modern state, and particularly, right, it's not the only one, but it's the most acute example, is Shabbat. And he gives all sorts of examples of how and why, and real problems which we have to give answers for. And now we're looking, 70 odd years later, some of these things have been solved, many of them still have not been solved. I'll read you, again, this is not on your handout, but I'll read you some of what he says. For example, says Leibovich, he says, "Ein ליהדות הדתית שום מושג ברור על תכנן ומשמעותן המוחשית והריאלית של הלכות שבת לגבי מדינה וחברה עצמאית של עם ישראל בהווה." He argues, he says that, how does he say it? היהדות הדתית, the religious Judaism, in other words, Torah, does not have the concept of a modern state. It doesn't have the concept of how you treat Hilchot Shabbat in a state. He says in Achlalat, again, this is not on your handout, I apologize. He says in Achlalat bayot hamdina v'achevra v'tafkidahen v'mizkeret ha'chayim asher tzibur v'yachid. Oh, I won't read it all inside. But he goes through different examples. He says you have a chayal, you have soldiers, you have policemen, you have sailors, you have government officials, all sorts of things who cannot function on Shabbat. That is a sign that halacha has nothing to say about this reality, and halacha cannot solve it. He says it's incompatible. So what do we have to do? He says we have to create a new framework. We have to create a new dynamic. His argument is that the same way as in the Mikdash, in the Beit HaMikdash, we have a concept that there is no shvut b'Mikdash. When it comes to Hilchot Shabbat, we have things which are prohibited on a Doraita level and things which are on a Darabanan level. Generally speaking, rabbinic prohibitions of Shabbat are called shvutim. So the concept is, in the Beit HaMikdash, there is no shvut. Anything which was that's part of the general running of the Mikdash, there are things which are Doraita, which are allowed to do in the Mikdash as well. For example, we know in the Beit HaMikdash there's a korbanot. You have a korban tamid every single day, including Shabbat. Shabbat has its own special korbanot. You have to shech the korban. One of the 39 melachot is shchita. You're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbat. For the purposes of the korbanot, you're allowed to do that. Okay, that's learned out from a specific Zarat HaKatuv. So he says we need to come up with something new, because Torah, as you and I know it, does not have an answer, cannot deal with this. Yeah. So we've never had a state in the sense of a modern state. You think about, I'll give you some of the examples. You think about running power plants, for example, right? That was not, nowadays, By the way, part of the solution to many of these problems comes from the technology itself. Nowadays, everything is automated, and that has a great advantage. But it's fascinating to see, how did the Rabbanim deal with this in the 1950s and 60s, when you do not have this automation, etc. You have to give an answer. Maybe if the answer is let's wait and see what happens, that's not a great answer. But so the use of electricity, for example, there are still certain places where people use generators. They don't want to benefit from electricity that was made on Shabbat. Okay, but where does that come from? It comes from the fact that in the early years of the state, things were done manually. You had workers at the power plant shoveling the coal, whatever it is, and the electricity is being generated through melacha, through actual desecration of Shabbat that Jewish people are doing. Nowadays, everything's automated. So that's a different question. But essentially, this is his argument. Let's have a look on the second side of the page of the handout that you have in front of you. There's an article here from 2012, written in response to this by Dr. Meir Frankel. So he says, he gives a few of the examples of the difficulties which we have. For example, he says, source number 5, Nihul Beit Cholim b'Shabbat. I mentioned this before, operating a hospital on Shabbat. בבית חולים ישנם מרכיבים רבים שהם בירוקרטיים החיוניים להתנהלות תקינה של בית החולים. So there are many operations in the hospital. Again, I think bureaucracy is a word that was invented not that long ago, 1 or 2 centuries ago. Again, in the days of Shlomo HaMelech, I'm not sure how much bureaucracy they had in the Mikdash. They probably had some, but nowhere near the extent that things are today. You go to a hospital, think about the number of forms that you have to sign, think about the amount of paperwork, and there are certain things which are going to be pikuach nefesh, but there are many things which are not. Let's say a patient is discharged from hospital on Shabbat. So the doctor has to sign the letter to say that he can go home. If we say, no, it's Shabbat, I saw a suggestion once, we'll just let the patients go home on Shabbat, and on Motzei Shabbat we'll write all the records. I'm not saying this is done anywhere, but it was floated in a discussion. That's going to lead to chaos. You can't do that. At the same time, you can't say that signing a letter for this patient to go home is pikuach nefesh. It's not going to kill him if you don't sign the letter. So therefore, but writing is a melacha d'oraita. How do we allow it? Okay, so that's just one example of many, and there are many, many more. May the manager of the hospital transgress Torah violations in order to deal with bureaucratic matters, which are essential for the operation of the hospital, but they are not essential for the direct saving of a life on Shabbat. Second example, right? The foreign policy and diplomacy on Shabbat. So this is a topic which was raised by Leibovich. He says, let's say the Israeli consul in a foreign country, he gets told he's waiting for an important meeting with, I don't know, the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State, whatever it is. And in this particular meeting, is there going to be anything that is right now directly pikuach nefesh? No. But having the meeting could be very beneficial, could be beneficial economically, beneficial diplomatically, politically, whatever else. And that involves Chilul Shabbat in order to get there and participate. Ein kan pikuach nefesh miyadi. There is no immediate pikuach nefesh, saving of a life. אך האם דומה שיפור מעמדו הכלכלי של הפרט לקידום מעמדו הכלכלי של מדינת ישראל? אולי נציע לו להשתמש בקונסול שבת הפועל בגרמה. Okay, maybe there's a way doing things indirectly, etc. Next example, he says, משטרה, the police. This is an example, again, we've discussed many times in the past. תחום שבו עסקו רבות הרב ישראלי זצ"ל ואחרים, עדיין אין פתרון מערכתי. It's very difficult to find a broad solution. מה יעשה שוטר סיוע נקרא על ידי שכן המתלונן על רעש הנגרם בביתו של השכן בניגוד לחוק? Somebody's making a lot of noise on Shabbat, so they call up the police, right? From policemen, are they allowed to get into the patrol car and go there to tell the neighbor to stop making a noise? It depends which neighborhood you live in, right? There are some neighborhoods where there would be pikuach nefesh. It could turn into a fight, and things have happened. But otherwise not. So there are a lot of difficulties here. דוגמאות אלה הן קצה הקרחון, שאלות דומות עולות מדי שבת, זה כל מי שעוסק בתחומים אלה והדומים להם. Anybody who works in one of these professions or any of these areas discovers every week, every Shabbat, that things come up, כגון חברת חשמל, חברת הסלולר, right? Talk about infrastructure, electricity, communications infrastructures, etc. all of these, the common theme, common denominator in all of these things, is that all of them include some sort of work, which is not some sort of melacha, some sort of transgression of Hilchot Shabbat, which is not direct and immediate pikuach nefesh, but without it, the whole thing will ultimately come crashing down. So what do you do? I just give one more example from the realm of medicine. It's on the first page, which Rav Goren discussed at length. And I'll tell you already that not everybody agrees. Actually, most poskim disagree with Rav Goren, with his application of this. But he says the following. Again, just to understand the difference between the individual and the national, etc. So we've mentioned a lot, we've thrown around the concept of pikuach nefesh. I just mentioned, may be familiar, but there is the most fundamental tshuva, the most fundamental response written, probably the most fundamental response written in all of medical halacha. It was by the Nodab Yehuda in Prague in the 18th century. And the Nodab Yehuda is the one who defines for us really what the borders of pikuach nefesh are. Because if you think about it, we know anything that is right now directly saving a life, that is pikuach nefesh. For that I can break Shabbat. But the question is, how far does it go? We also say safek pikuach nefesh, something which is doubtful, which may save a life. For the example the Mishnah gives, let's say there's a pile of rubble, and you don't know, there's somebody underneath. You don't know if they're alive or dead. So you might be clearing away the rubble. You may not be for the purposes of pikuach nefesh, but you're allowed to do it because the person there might still be alive. You might still be saving their life. Okay. With a little bit of imagination, we could stretch this and say many activities that a person may do may be ultimately lead to saving a life. For example, let's say I'm a medical student, right? And there's a lecture on Shabbat. It's the world expert in whatever it is. It's a one-time opportunity. They're not going to, the lecture won't be recorded. I need to drive to the university to hear this lecture because one day it will give me the medical knowledge that I may be able to save somebody's life. Okay, that we would not allow. Precise question that he was asked by the community in London. The question that he was asked relates to an autopsy, and the question is autopsy. This is not chilul Shabbat. There are other violations involved nivul hamet and different things in terms of respecting the dead body. So he's asked, can they perform an autopsy to learn, about this disease, whatever it was, in order to save lives in the future? So his answer is, it depends. He says, if you have a choleh lifnechem, if Reuven has just died, right, and Shimon is now ill as well, he's lying in the bed next to him or in the next room in the hospital, okay, and we think that it's the same illness and we don't know how to treat it. But if we perform the autopsy on Reuven, we might save Shimon's life. Then you can do it. But if the purpose of performing the autopsy is just to gain extra medical knowledge that maybe sometime in the future we'll know how to do it, he says that you can't do that. Okay, and based on that, the poskim say that when it comes to performing autopsies for the purpose of learning anatomy, that goes against the halacha. That is forbidden. So says Rav Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of Tzahal, and chief rabbi of the state of Israel as well, he says all that is good and well when you're in Chutz La'aretz. When we're talking about an individual, he says ultimately the medical knowledge has to move forward. Ultimately somebody has, so you'll say, so the non-Jews will perform autopsies and medicine will advance in that way. But if I'm now in a Jewish state, and now I have a Beit Sefer LaRefuah, and now we need to, what are we going to do? So he essentially says, he's audacious enough to say, that even the Nodab Yehuda and the Chatam Sofer would agree with him, that nowadays you can perform the autopsy, and that's called, and that would be permitted. Okay, so that's one example. Like I say, many poskim disagree, and that's a subject in and of its own right, but that's one example of how we might say, okay, throughout the years of exile, we were asked one question related to the individual. Now we're asking a different question, and we're going to see how it relates to the state, how it relates to the nation. And we have the tools. If we look hard enough, we'll find the tools to deal with this. Okay, so that was the argument of Leibovich. And the one who wrote Kuntres HaVikuach, which I showed you before, the argument was Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria. Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria was one of the leading Dati Leumi Rabbanim in the early years of the state. He writes an entire booklet. It's available online. You can download it. It's fascinating to go through and to read the whole thing. But what I want to do with you maybe now in the time we have left is just go through. There are 6 main arguments. I haven't brought everything here, but there are essentially 6 main arguments which are brought by Leibovich and 6 main refutations which are brought by Rav Neria. And at the end, he comes to a little bit of a paradigm shift, which will maybe give us a a broad understanding of how this whole thing works and why we have maybe the wrong impression of it. Let me just first again read to you something which is not on your Daf Makorot. The booklet Havikoach is about 30 pages long, so I couldn't include the whole thing, but I printed for myself an excerpt of one of the chapters. And I just want to share it with you, one of the specific examples that he gives of how he deals with these claims. So he says like this. This is now Rav Neria. He says, we'll use a practical example from one of the examples which we were given. He says, right, Misrad HaChutz v'Shirut HaDiplomati, the foreign office diplomatic services. So what happens here, the issue is, you have communications. In the time that he was writing, it was telegrams and telegraphs. Now it's slightly different forms of technology. But these messages which are coming through on Shabbat, or cables, or whatever it is. And all sorts of messages come through the entire Shabbat. Some of them are going to be very, very important and could be life-saving, right? And some of them are, happy birthday to the foreign minister, okay? So he says, what was the argument? The argument is you telling me that the Torah cannot sanction, the foreign office to work on Shabbat. We cannot have diplomacy on Shabbat. And you're telling me, and essentially we're saying that if you are a frum Jew, you have to, like the Menchat Yitzchak said, in his case, he said you have to avoid this profession, you can't go there, you can't be in the diplomatic corps. So says Rav Neria, I'll tell you what, the problem's not with us, it's the problem's with you. He says, there are obviously going to be very, very important messages, which need to immediately reach the foreign minister or the prime minister or whoever it is. Maybe the entire government, they need to discuss it, they need to make a decision, they need to issue a response. And these are things which, if we wait for them, if you're going to wait until Shabbat, you're going to stand outside and wait for the 3 stars and wait till Shabbat's come out, okay, by then it's too late. You've missed the opportunity. So obviously, he says, Ein safek, ki kabbalat yediyot elu avratan el radio, telephone or telegraph doche Shabbat. There's no question. Those are important things. Those are related to Pekuach Nefesh. You can transfer that information, that communication over Shabbat. However, he says there are going to be many messages and many things which are just day-to-day routine messages. There is no urgency at all. There's no really real importance, and we cannot allow Chilul Shabbat for that. So there are things which are certainly forbidden, things which are certainly permitted, and then you have messages which may fall in a gray area, which may fall somewhere in between. Now, he says the difficulty is, who's determining whether the message, the communication right now is urgent and life-saving, or it's not urgent and life-saving. And essentially his argument is this. He said is that if you had, which today you have, and it would be interesting to hear, I know there are ambassadors of Israel around the world who are Shomrei Shabbat and Shomrei Torah Mitzvot, and it would be interesting to hear how they deal with this practically, if they're allowed to tell us. But the situation, at least then, was this office is being run by people that are completely secular. For them, there is no Shabbat. So a message comes in, the message has to be given, and they're saying, you rabbis won't allow us to forward the messages. And Rav Neria is saying, it's your fault, because you won't distinguish between what is critical and what is high importance and what is low importance. And if it's something which, if you would tell us and you would distinguish properly and authentically between messages which are of high importance, okay, things which are in the gray zone, we'll find a way, we'll find a solution. We'll see maybe next week what we do with that. But by saying that everything is important, and then you throw it on us and say, well, we can't be Mechalel Shabbat. That's just not fair. That's disingenuous. He says like this, Lachen, Ilu amad shomer Torah berosh Misrad HaChutz. If you had a frum Jew standing at the, who was in charge of the Misrad HaChutz, היה שולח הוראה חמורה לכל מקורות המודיעין שבחוץ לארץ, sent out to all the intelligence sources in around the world and said, אין להשתמש בשירותי המודיעין על המשמר של המשרד בשבתות. Don't use these channels of communication on Shabbat unless it really is an essential message, right? Not happy birthday and the like. Then, right, ידיעות שאין באיכורן משום פיקוח נפש המדינה, ישודרו במוצאי Shabbat. Those things which are not pikuach nefesh, which are not essential, that can wait till Motzei Shabbat will wait. Then we would say, אז היה מותר לכל יהודי דתי לעבוד בשירות המודיעין של משרד החוץ. Then we would say that any from Jew who wants to can work in these services. And we've seen similar things that have happened through the police and through the army over the years. Okay, so that's one example he gives. There are many others as well. So let's look back at the handout now for a moment on again, the second page of the handout. I've put here havikuach, right? As I say, I've not listed all 30 pages of the articles back and forth, but these are essentially the 6 main arguments that we see. I'll read through the headings on the page, and I have them over here written out in Hebrew and with a little bit more explanation, and we'll go through them one by one. So the first one is, and again, this was the claim that Shabbat is a religious problem. I've put problem here in inverted commas on purpose. This is something we have, even amongst the Dati community. Sometimes you find, take the example of Shemitah. Every 7 years or so, we have all sorts of conferences and Yemei and articles are written and books are published and all sorts. Everybody wants to know, how do we solve the problem of Shemitah in our days? Right? Shemitah is not a problem. Shemitah is a mitzvah from the Torah. What do we do? We're in an ideal reality. The problem is caused by the fact that we aren't observing it the way we should. It's not Shemitah D'Oraita, and therefore we don't have the bracha that the year before. We have triple crop, etc. That's the problem. But Shemitah itself is not the problem. Here too, Shabbat is not a problem. But Leibovich is arguing. He says, yes, Shabbat is a religious problem. He says, this is not something technical. It's not that you don't know, you aren't providing the solutions. He says, inherently, it's incompatible with the situation of Shabbat, of a modern state. I hope that by now we've showed enough examples to show that it doesn't need to be incompatible. But that was his argument. That was his claim. And he says, therefore, since it's incompatible, because you cannot have, for example, internal security services and water and electricity and a navy and industry and infrastructure and diplomatic corps and all sorts of things on Shabbat, he says, therefore, you have to change Shabbat. Right? Rav Neria says, that's ridiculous. Right? We don't have to change. Right? Again, you haven't been asking the right questions. If you ask the right questions, we'll give the right answers. And that's essentially the second critique. The second argument is, he says, what is the rabbi's answer? He says, we've got all these problems. We know, you tell us. Unfortunately, this is something that we still have today sometimes. The rabbis just tell us what we can't do. Say, asur, 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 asur. Everything's forbidden. Okay, but so what can we do, right? Suggest a solution, suggest an alternative. And he says, right, this is different to the first argument. The first argument is that intrinsically, inherently, there is no solution. The second argument is the fact that you haven't suggested a concrete plan, right, that's a sign that, again, takes us back to the first, that there isn't one. Because if there was one, you'd come up with one. And what Rav Neria says again is he says, this is ludicrous. You can't blame us that you're observing things in such a way. You're ignoring Shabbat. You're running everything as, according to routine. And then you're telling us that we don't give you a concrete plan for how to run things on Shabbat. Right? If you, who is in charge of the industry, the infrastructure, the military, the police, whatever it is, if you would determine what are the things that are essential and what are the things that are not essential, and you would make those distinctions, then we could come and we could give an answer. We could give a concrete plan. We could say you can do this on Shabbat, you can't do this on Shabbat, etc., and everything can work. And as we see, it does work in hospitals and in the army and places like that. But the moment that you're not doing that and you're just saying, well, everything is essential, well, it's not, and then we can't do that. One of the examples, we mentioned the police. The police is a very, very interesting case study. There was a big argument on this point between Rabbi Israeli, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Merkaz Harav, and he was on the council of the chief rabbinate, and Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel. And Rav Herzog writes an article. Rav Israeli really was known as the Marad Atra in this whole realm of Torah Medina. He was really a pioneer in this field, and he came up with many heterim and many solutions to these questions. He institutes a journal called Betzomet HaTorah VaMedina, and he asks different rabbanim to write in it. So one of the rabbanim he asked to write was Rav Herzog, and he asked Rav Herzog to write about the police on Shabbat. And Rav Herzog writes his article, and Rav Israeli writes his response, which is longer than the original article. And the article that Rav Herzog writes, he says, I cannot find solution for many things. He says, one of the problems why, he says, even where there is a halachic mechanism which allows something to be done, for example, we have a concept of itiru sofan mishum tchilatan. This is something that we still rely on. For example, doctors, driving to the hospital on Shabbat for a shift, they're allowed to go there and they're allowed to drive back. Because, again, I'm not getting into now the practicalities of it, and everybody should, needs a psak for their particular case. This is not a psak, but the general principle is, for those where we say that they can go back, the reason is, we say that if we're not going to allow you to go back after your shift, then you won't go in the first place, then we won't have doctors, then we won't have, etc. So says Rav Herzog, So we could use that principle to say that a policeman who goes to a certain patrol can come back. He says, well, we can't say Hitiros Sofan Mishum Tchilatan because it's not true, because there are many policemen who are not observant, and they'll drive wherever they can. So they'll go anyway. So if we now say to the religious soldier, the religious policeman, you can drive there because if I don't allow you to break Shabbat, then I won't have a functioning police force. He says, well, we'll have a functioning police force because the people who don't care about Shabbat will just do whatever they want to do. And Rabbi Israeli writes back to him, he says, I can't accept that argument. He says, we have to look at it from a pure halachic perspective, assuming that everybody would listen to us. It's a big assumption to make by a rabbi, right? But assuming everybody would listen to us, then what would the halacha be? And that's how. So that's essentially what Rav Neria says. Yeah, he says, you're telling me we don't have an answer. We don't have a concrete plan, a concrete solution. You're not giving us the tools, you're not giving us the ability to give you a concrete solution. But the moment that it becomes possible, and as I say, we've seen it over the decades, then we will. Okay, third argument. This is a very, very interesting one. Relying on non-Jews. We know that in Halakha there is a concept of, right, Goy Shel Shabbat. It's often misunderstood. And sometimes people think that anything that I can't do on Shabbat, I can just ask a non-Jew to do for me. That is completely wrong. In most cases, and the default position is, something that I may not do on Shabbat, I may not ask a non-Jew to do on Shabbat. I may not hint to a non-Jew to do it on Shabbat. Now, there are many exceptions. For a choleh, for a person who is ill, for a person who is infirm, for where there is a great need for it, for a mitzvah need. Again, I'm not getting into, these are broad principles, we don't have time to get into all the technicalities. But what he says is, this may be a wonderful solution for many of the cases we've discussed. Where you have an area where it's not direct pikuach nefesh, it's a gray area, right? Let's go back to the case that we started at the beginning with our soldier, the Dover Tzahal, the spokesman's unit, wants to put out messages on Shabbat. So if you have non-Jews, if you have Jew soldiers that are working there, they can put out the messages, right? Can you rely on non-Jews for the functioning of the state? So says Leibovich, he says, come on, right? If you're telling me that your Torah has got the solutions to everything, so you're going to rely on non-Jews. He says that's ridiculous. I'll tell you who agreed with him on this point. It's very interesting, was Rav Goren, right? Rav Shlomo Goren, who was, he says, and this is from a lecture that he gave regarding running a hospital on Shabbat. He says, Ani ba'ofen ekroni neged, this is not on your handout, Ani ba'ofen ekroni neged ha-shimush, yoter nachon, neged ha-pitaron shel bayot shelanu al-yedei goyim shel Shabbat. He says, I don't agree that you should use non-Jews to solve your problems on Shabbat. Mishum shani ma'amin b'Torah, shi Torat chayim v'Torah nitzchit, she'efshar litot ha'bayot ha'atiyot shelanu lefi halacha. He says, I believe in the Torah, and I believe that our Torah can solve the problems that we may have. Now, who disagrees? This is very interesting. Rav Kook. Rav Kook, and he's very, very forceful on this point that I mentioned when this whole discussion about milking cows on Shabbat, many of the moshavim and the kibbutzim were looking for solutions which involved Jews themselves milking the cows on Shabbat in a permitted way. And Rav Kook says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And he says, and he writes in his halachic responsa, he says, anyways, you should know that in order for there to be a functioning Jewish state, we need non-Jews that are going to do some of the malachot on Shabbat. So essentially his answer is, you've decided that the solution of having a Goy Shel Shabbat is not an appropriate solution. But who says? This is Rav Goren, with all due respect. Right? Navdil, Professor Leibovich, with all due respect, you're saying the Torah doesn't have a solution. The Torah has a solution. You decided you don't like it, but what's the problem? Same thing for the next one. He talks about technical solutions. Maybe I should have written here technological solutions. All sorts of grammar devices and this and that. And again, we fast forward a number of decades. We have all sorts of automation and all sorts of technological solutions, which at the time maybe seemed impractical, but they're practical and they work. Okay. He talks about here a hesitance to rely on different types of heterim. So you have different things. You have a shinui, you have performed in an unusual way, and it's a b'diavad, and it's a shadat chak, and all sorts of things. And again, it's really the same argument. Leibovich is saying, why should we rely on those things? Come on, he says, if your Torah is good enough to solve all these things, why do you have to rely on all these loopholes? And the answer is, no, that's the way that the Torah allowed us to deal with these things. These are built in, these are part of the system, and they work. That's the solution. Right? It's like you're having an argument and I'm telling you the answer. You're saying, no, but I don't like that answer. Okay, I don't care if you like it or not. It works. Right? And finally, he makes this comparison to the Mikdash. He says that we should view the Medina in a way that we view the Mikdash, and therefore give it all sorts of leniencies, which we do not accept. Again, says Rav Neria, what you're essentially trying to do is that you are trying to reform the halakha. You're trying to change the frame. You're trying to create a new halacha. And what Rav Neria's ultimate argument is, well, this will conclude. He says there's a wonderful article here. I brought you an excerpt, source number 7. This is Chaim Meir Neria. So this is Rav Neria's grandson. And he writes this in Piers and Makori Shon in 2012. But he says essentially what Rav Neria is arguing is not that we are changing halacha, but essentially that for 2,000 years, the halacha itself was distorted. You see, we didn't answer. It's not that halacha, the Torah, is built to deal with the individual. And then when we now are in a situation where we have a state and we're a collective national entity, we don't have the tools. So this is the ideal way. This is the way it was meant to be all along. Right? For instance, the days of David, days of Shlomo, the Torah was built for a tzibur. The Torah is not a Torah of the individual. It's a Torah of the tzibur. That's the way it's meant to be. But what happened? 2,000 years we were in exile, and we lost it, and we forgot, and it became distorted, and it became we dealt with what we had, but that was not the ideal. That was not the situation we were meant. That's not the ideal situation. We were meant to be in it because for whatever reason Hashem decided that's what we needed for 2,000 years. But now we're back, and now it's about going back to normal, and now it's about relearning all those things in the Torah, which deals with the tzibur and which deals with the collective entity. That's the way it's meant to be. Have a look, source number 7. He says, "Katalmido shel Raya is Rav Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Rav Kook. Ra'a Rav Neria et yesoda shel Torah k'Torat tzibur v'lo k'Torat yachid." This really is the crux of the entire argument. This is what it's really about. He says he saw the Torah as that of the community and not the Torah of the individual. Achen במהלך שנות הגלות ובעקבות חורבן הממלכתיות היהודיות הותאמה התורה על ידי חז"ל למציאת החיים בגולה. Right? He says throughout the generations of exile and after the destruction, not just of the temple, but the destruction of the sovereign Jewish kingdom, right? This is very connected to Hanukkah, which is coming up. The Torah had to be compatible, had to be, I don't want to say adjusted, but had to be applied to the reality of life that was in the Golah. This, by the way, this may be why Chazal tell us. They say that from the day of the Churban, it says in the Gemara Brachot, from the day of the Churban and the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish people went into exile, it says, "Ein lacha bitul Torah gadol mizeh." There is no greater bitul Torah, no greater nullification of the Torah since we went into exile, since we were dispersed. What does that mean? So there are those who understand. The simple understanding is, when we lived in one community, when we were in Eretz Yisrael, so there's a machloket in halacha, there's Beit Hillel and there's Beit Shammai, we argue, we solve the question, we paskin halacha this way. But when you have, the Jewish world is dispersed all over the place. So you have Rashi in France and Tosfot there, and you have the Rambam in Egypt and in Spain, and we're scattered all over the world. And Rashi doesn't know what the Rambam said, and the Rambam doesn't know what the Ramban and the Rashba, and everybody's asking something different. It becomes not one Torah. We have all sorts of machlokot. We have hundreds of Torah, and we don't know what it is. That's Bitul Torah. We've lost the ability to have a. But maybe it means something else. Maybe it means that the ultimate Torah, which is the Torah of Tzibur, which we have when we're in our own community, in our own sovereign state, when we're in exile, we lose that. We lose the ability to see the Torah in that way, and the Torah itself becomes distorted. Therefore, עבודתם של אנשי כנסת הגדולה הייתה לבצר את התורה בפנימיותה, להחדירה לתוך העם, שלא תיפגע שוב מהיעדר עצמאות מדינית. So the Torah had to be kept in such a way that we wouldn't lose it completely while we were in exile. But nonetheless, now that we are back, we can go back to the original form of what the Torah was meant to be and how it deals with these situations and how we do it. As I say, it's an open question. We're still dealing with it. We're still finding the ways to apply it in all the different scenarios. But that maybe just gives you an understanding of what the discussion is, where it comes from, why it was so vociferous, and right, that is the message, that we are back. The Torah has the answers. It has the principles, and it's up to us to dig deep enough in order to find them. Okay.